Don's been here many times. He's a professor emeritus of political science at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He's now a distinguished visiting professor at the U.S. Army War College. Don holds a doctorate in public policy from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in economics and public policy from the University of Wisconsin. Early in his military career, Dr. Snider served 3 combat tours as an infantryman in the Republic of Vietnam. After battalion command in the 7th Infantry Division, he specialized in military strategy and defense policy, serving consecutively as the Chief of Plans for Theater Army in Europe, Joint Planner for the Army Chief of Staff, the Federal Executive Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He served on the staff of the National Security Council in the White House, serving as Director of Defense Policy in both the Reagan and Bush administrations. In his final active duty position, he served in the Office of the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. Dr. Snider was research director, co-editor, and chapter author for 3 recent books on the Army as a profession. The Future of the Army Profession, now a textbook at the Army War College in West Point, Forging the Warrior's Character, Moral Precepts from the Cadet Prayer, and also a text at West Point, and American Civil-Military Relations, The Soldier in the State in a New Era, commemorating the 50th anniversary of Huntington's classic, The Soldier in the State. He'll be speaking on the subject of maintaining a military profession during defense reductions. Welcome, Dr. Snider.
Thanks. Thank you for the kind words. Let me affirm all of you for being here. It's a delight for me to come back to the Newport, particularly when the weather's like this, because some of my other visits, it was slip and slide in and slip and slide out, and that certainly is not the case today. So it's a delight to be able to be here to serve you. For the young folks in the audience, the students here, I sincerely want to affirm what you're doing, taking time out of your career to do what professionals seldom have the time to do, and that is the reflective practice, which is the essence of being a professional. By reflective practice, just the opportunity to listen, as you did to the last panel, of new ideation, new concepts, new frameworks, and then for you to construct yourselves in your mind, new relationships, new moral meaning. That's what a conference about ethics is about. And so my challenge today is to add to the very fine introduction that you were given in the by the first panel. And I intend to do that with a rather strong assertion. As much as I respect the Dean's new model of the 3 cultures of war and his exhortation to you to think about them, I would submit that unless you and your generation of officers and leaders, civilian leaders also in the military, unless your generation maintain your institution as a profession during the next 5 to 10 years, then it doesn't make any difference what culture or what model of warfare you adopt, because it will not be largely successful if all you have to implement it is an obedient military bureaucracy. And that's the choice. That's the choice you get to make, because you are now growing to positions of leadership in your military service. And that service, after the build down, Jim Kitfield was absolutely correct. We've had 3 of these build downs. We got a little understanding now. It looks like this one's going to be about the same size as the rest of them. And the last 2 build downs, well, the one after Vietnam was catastrophic, and we created a new volunteer force. But the subsequent build downs have been about 1/3 in force structure and 1/3 in total obligational authority. Those are significant whacks out of institutions. 1/3 of the structure of the institution and 1/3 of the fungible resources of the institution for future periods. So there's going to be adaptation. And your dean was absolutely correct to point out that how culture adapts is, in fact, more critical than how the technology and the organizations and the structures adapt. And so I'm going to come in from the side a little bit from what the first panel said, and I'm asserting to you that I want to create in your mind a different lens to look through as you think through the build down, not the lens of culture, exactly in the way the dean presented it. I want you to think of the lens of profession. What does it mean to be a military profession during a defense build down and to come out the other side of the build down still intact as a profession? And so I'm going to do some contrasting between professions and other kinds of government occupations or government bureaucracies. Here's what I want to work on today. Your identity. How do you think of yourselves? Who are you? And what I want to help you, your college is working on all these things. I want to work down here. I want to help you understand what it means to be a professional in the sense that you're not just a member of the profession. You've done that now for the 10 to 15 to 16 to whatever number of years that you've been serving. So I'm not here to speak to you about that, but you are about to become the stewards of the profession. And the stewards of the profession are going to be immensely challenged during this bid down because we know what happens during build downs. You take a third of the structure and a third of the resources out of a hierarchical institution, and it will react just like a body reacts when you put an electric shock on it. And that natural reaction will be to bureaucratize, to highly centralize, to micromanage, and to do many things that are utterly antithetical to the culture of a profession. And that's what I want to help you understand today. What does that look like? First point, this was the conclusion of a study, the first book that we published. This was the lament of an Army major serving in one of our large bases in the Northwest. And we were going through the Army doing both qualitative and quantitative analysis on what it means to be a profession. And this is what she came back in 2001 after the last build down and told us, how can I be a professional if there is no profession? And the answer is, you can't. And that's the danger. That's why I'm here to talk to you today. Now, don't get me wrong. You can be a professional serving in a non-profession after you've been developed. Think of the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee. The staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee has many professionals from many fields serving on that staff, but they did not develop as professionals on that staff. They were developed uniquely as you have been developed in the culture and in the practice of your profession. Professionals start at the bottom and work their way up by acquiring over long years of work the tacit knowledge that it takes to apply expert knowledge. Tacit knowledge, folks, is not taught in books. You can't get tacit knowledge out of books. It is only learned experientially. That's the nature of that form of knowledge. So, her question was, how can I be a professional if there's no profession? And she looked around the United States Army and said, this place is a big bureaucracy. And they're trying to conform me in the mold of a bureaucrat, and I didn't sign up to be a bureaucrat, so guess what? I'm leaving. I resigned last week. During the period of the last build down, right after it, the loss rate of captains in the Army, as Jim Kitfield already told you, it was called the exodus of the captains. Normally in any year, 22,000 captains in the Army, 7% leave. That's normal. That's the attrition that we can sustain. For 2 years, 90 and 91, 13% of the captains walked. Why did they walk? They walked because, as this young lady told me, I can't be a professional, and I know what it means to be a professional. I'm granted autonomy. I get to decide. Nobody looks over my shoulder. You trust me. And the bureaucratic tendency of a build down, the conforming nature of that, stifled, and we lost a lot of the best professionals that we had. Oh, I got to put it at this. So, I'm going to give you 3 charts. This is in the abstract. This is building a new lens for you. I want you to understand how to think about your service as a military profession. And, wait a minute, did I? It jumped just one? There you are. So let's think about military professions. If you want to have a military professions, a society has 3 choices about how to have an information age producing, and I'm going to use the Army example throughout because I study the Army. Now, I know that here at the Naval War College, you folks are just now starting a major effort to study the Navy service as a profession. So what I'm giving you is the roadmap we've used for the last, I guess, almost 10 years now in moving this study along in the Army, and in the last year, under General Dempsey's direction and now General Cohn's direction, an in-depth review of the Army as a profession as we come out of 10 years of war. But in the abstract, if a society wants a military profession, you can buy one. We did a lot of that in the last 10 years. They're called contractors. Contractors are not professionals. They work under the profit motive. They have a different ethos. Many of them are former professionals and very good people. That's not my point. Society considers them contractors, and they work in a market. You can have a bureaucracy, as I've mentioned, or you can have a profession. And notice, professions use specialized knowledge, and they control their own work. Autonomy. Great autonomy at each level in the hierarchy. Trust at each level in the hierarchy. So, 3 choices. Obviously, I'm going to argue that you would want to have a military profession. Here's a quick contrast. This is probably the most important chart I'll show you all morning. This is a quick contrast between what it means to be a profession and what it means to be just a government occupation, just a government bureaucracy. Think of the Department of Agriculture. All good people doing good work for the government, but not a profession. Some of them professionally trained before, now working in that department. Expert knowledge versus non-expert. What is expert knowledge? Something that takes about 6 to 8 years. It's based on an abstract set of knowledge and then practiced. And so there is relationship between developing the abstract knowledge and the practice. You accept lifelong learning. Someone working in a bureaucracy basically says to the leaders, you develop me. You're responsible for training me to do my job. That's not the mindset of the professional. That's not the ethos or the culture of the professional. Professionals only work in new situations. If you find yourself routinely doing the same thing every day, that's the work of a bureaucrat. Think of a doctor in a clinic. Every patient that walks in, different blood type, different history, DNA, different symptoms, a list of prescriptions, different pharmacology. Every single patient the doctor sees is new. Every time an infantry platoon leader went on patrol in Iraq, it was a new situation. And if they didn't approach it as a new situation, every time one of you folks in the naval services go on an attack mission, if you don't approach it as a new situation, you are missing it. You are not behaving as a professional. Only expert work to new situations, and notice the work is done by humans. Now, you may have tons of technology at your disposal, particularly if you're an A-7 pilot or a more modern aircraft pilot. But that's not your practice. Your practice, folks, is not technology. Let me give you a stark example of this. I had a little bout with cancer a few years ago, and I was selecting a surgeon. And in the course of conversation with the surgeon, I was asking him, when you do this surgery, how many people come out with condition A and how many with condition B? And I was trying to create trust between me and the professional that was going to do the surgery. And at some point in the conversation, he says, well, you know, when we get into part of this surgery, it's entirely possible I won't be able to see where I'm cutting. I said, excuse me? That's me you're cutting on. And you're telling me you may not be able to see? He said, yeah, that's sometimes body conformation, etc. But it is possible that I will not. But don't worry, I've trained my fingers, and they can tell by tactile methods the difference between cancerous tissue and pure tissue. That, folks, is quintessentially the practice of a professional. The human touch. Now, he had in that operating room, Westchester Medical Center, millions of dollars of technology. That isn't what I was hiring him for. I hired him to cure me. I was going to die if he didn't get the cancer out of my body. This is the situation with professionals all the time. The sinner wants absolution. The sick want a cure. The defenseless wants security. And they only care if you are effective. The American people have spent extra supplementals for a decade now, fighting 2 wars that were fortunately now winding down, but they didn't argue about the money. All of the debates in the public sector are about effectiveness, not efficiency. That's for bureaucracies. There's only one measure of a profession. Are you effective or not? And I was picking someone on a trust relationship that I wanted him to be effective. And fortunately, he was. It's a trust relationship. Professions, because of these other factors, develop an ethos. And that ethos has to be self-policed, because nobody else knows how to police a profession. They don't know what you do. They can't say you're doing it right or wrong, except as they look at the outcome. Besides, you want to maintain their trust. You own it to police yourselves. And folks, I'll tell you right now, that's one of your major problems. We've just spent a year surveying the Army in great detail, quantitatively and qualitatively. And we have lessened our focus on self-policing in any number of standards, simply because of the pressure of 10 years of war and the pace of rotation. Self-policing is absolutely essential, and it's one of the most difficult things. You will never have a meritocratic ethic, which is the ethic of professions. Meritocracy rules here. It does not rule over here. You play all sorts of power games over here. Not here. Self-policing, intrinsic motivations, this is a job. This is a calling. And I can't tell you the number of young officers over my, now I guess 51 years of service, that I have counseled, please resign. You're not called to this. The life of a professional is to be lived. It's not work. If you're just here for the work and you're here for the paycheck, then, man, you picked a very arduous place to get a paycheck and have fun. No. This is about calling. Vocare in the Latin, the sacred vocation, the ability to attach yourself to something that is bigger than you are, more important than you are. If that's not the foundation and basis of your ethic, then I seriously doubt that you have adopted the culture of the military profession. So, immense contrast, immensely important. What is your practice? I've already alluded to this. This is your practice based on your knowledge. When you face a new situation, this is what you do. You classify, reason, and adapt. Inferential logic, someone would call it the military decision-making process. We have all sorts of names for it. But in essence, this is what you do. You classify the task, you reason, and then you act, and then you follow it for effectiveness. Did it work or not? And then you go back and adopt expert knowledge. I'm going to come back to this later. 2 things you have to have in your mind when you think professions: expert knowledge and expert practice. Do we have the right ones? And one of the great challenges going through a transition for military professions, going through a build down, is to be able to look forward and ask yourself, what expert knowledge must we have 6 years from now? Because it takes 6 years to translate expert knowledge into expert practice at the operational level of military professions. Now, Jim told you 3 to 5 years it took Petraeus to get the Army to learn how to fight counterinsurgency again. I was glad to hear him say those numbers, because my reading through history is that most of the military transformations in the interwar period, where they really adopted new theories of victory and substantively changed the culture and the purpose of the profession, took about 6 to 8 years. In some cases, it even took more than that. So here is your practice. Do you think about your practice that way? Does your service evaluate you on this? Or has it got some bureaucratic means of evaluating you? Are you developing your subordinates based upon this? Are you mentoring someone now were you mentored on this? See, that's what professions do. Bureaucracies don't do that. Now I want to give you very quickly about 6 or 8 charts that we've learned. This is the result of the last year's work in the Army, where we were asked About a year ago, I worked in a little center up at West Point for the study of the profession and ethic. We were asked by the Chief of Staff of the Army and Dempsey, who was then the commander of TRADOC, 3 questions. After 10 years of war, what does it mean for the Army to be a profession? Second question, after 10 years of war, what does it mean for a soldier to be a professional? Third question, how are we doing? How do we measure up to our own standards in this area? This is a study that was not directed by anybody other than the Chief of Staff of the Army, George Casey, in the last 6 months that he was in office in collaboration with General Dempsey. Why did they do it? Because that's what professions do. Nobody has to look over your shoulder and tell you. You don't have the GAO to come and say, now you do a study on this. This is the nature of professions, introspective. And so we've found some things that are not yet released. They're going to be released. The first year's annual report is finished. I'm going to give you some insights of what the Army is dealing with as a profession after 10 years of war, because I think it's insightful and instructive for the work that you're going to do here at this institution in taking a look at the Navy as a profession. We had to come up with a new typology for the profession because in the past, the Army has always thought of itself as the profession of arms. Of arms, of arms. And yet we got a lot of people in the Army that don't use arms. And we got a lot of branches now that in the way we're fighting dispersed operations are further moved away from combat. Some are more integral to combat. But the big issue we had was with civilians. We found out that the 230,000 civilians in our Corps are all over the Middle East theater in the middle of combat in different situations than our civilian Corps has ever been in before. So the big question came up, well, are you going to have a big study and study yourself as a profession and leave out 250,000 of your people who consider themselves professionals? Now, we hadn't done a very good job in the Army as developing our civilian Corps as professionals. Many of them are wage grade. Many of them are unionized. There's many things to be worked out here yet, and I'll show you how we work that out. Those folks are all in the white area. They are not yet serving professionals. They're aspiring professionals because they have not been certified in practice. I'll talk to you about certifications in just a minute. So anyway, the new typology says there is a profession of arms. There is a civilian Corps. Everybody is entered the profession. When you take an oath, you are a member of the profession. This is an immense debate in the Army. When a soldier comes to a training station and when a Marine goes to their training station and they come out of that training, are they a member of the profession then? Were they a member when they went in? How do you want to treat that? Which is most motivational for them? Which is most intrinsically rewarding? So we answered the question, once you take the oath as an all-volunteer, as a member of the all-volunteer force, we are accepting you as an aspiring professional at that point. You are a member of the profession. You're inside the circle. We had immense debates, folks, on who's in the circle and who's out. Notice, contractors are out. I can't tell you the hours that subject went round and round. You're an aspiring professional until your boundary of certification. And notice down here at the bottom, retired non-practicing professionals. That's me. When I moved from the active role to the retired role, I was no longer allowed to wear green tabs. I was no longer allowed to command. I'd lost my license to practice. But I'm still part of the profession because I spent the next 25 years studying the profession and leading. I still work in the profession. I'm now a civilian working in the profession, and I'm also a retired non-practicing professional. Why did we leave them in the profession in this diagram and in everything we're writing? Because of civil-military relations. Because of the critical role they play in the profession's civil-military relations, and the fact that we want them to consider you're still part of the profession, and even though not bound by law, you are bound by moral obligation to continue to adhere to the ethic of the profession. And I expect I'll get a lot of questions on that statement. So that's one thing that we've learned. The next thing we asked ourselves was, 6 years from now, after the Army has gone through this transition, if we took a look at the institution and said, okay, are you a profession or a bureaucracy, a government occupation, what distinctively would we go out and do research on? What would we look at to find out if after the build down we've succeeded and we have maintained profession through this process? We would look to see, are we trusted by the American people? Is there overall trust? And is that trust with the American people, our client, based upon these 5 essential characteristics? Trustworthiness internally, expertise, military expertise, the kind of expertise that does not exist anywhere else, and is it the right expertise for the environment we're going to be serving in? Do we have still a winning spirit, an indomitable, resilient winning spirit? Are we serving honorable with an ethos that is built upon this foundation? And do we have a senior leadership in the profession that understands that there won't be a profession unless they create one? Who creates the professions? Who maintains the professions? What we decided and what we've published in the last year, and it's now becoming Army doctrine, the stewards of the Army profession are the sergeants major, the colonels, the generals, and their civilian equivalents. That's it. Majors can't make a profession. Lieutenant colonels can't make a profession. Junior sergeants can't make a profession. They can each be professional, but they can't make a profession because they do not control the major management systems that allow a large government bureaucracy to be and behave as a profession, and almost every one of those systems is a human resource system. How do you promote? How do you acquire? How do you develop? How do you train? How do you discharge? What kind of meritocratic ethic do you adhere? All of the things that humans do, critically the function of leadership, is what makes a profession. And so the stewards of the profession, if you don't have stewards, you won't have a profession. Incidentally, I don't want to speak unkindly to any allies here. One stage in my military career, I was responsible for all the war plans of the Theater Army at the height of the Cold War in Europe, while we were deploying the Pershing missile and convincing the leaders of the Soviet Union that, in fact, yes, their second echelon tank armies were really vulnerable below the nuclear threshold, Marty, with a weapon whose circular probable error was so finite that it astounded even our developers. And at that time, when I had all those war plans, there were at least 7 military professions in Europe. How many are there today? Well, I'll let you answer that, but research says far less. Far less. What happened to them? They're still there. They still serve their countries. They're still wearing uniforms, but they're not military professions. They're obedient military bureaucracies. They're not producing new expert knowledge, and they're not producing new expert practices. And those are the critical items that you look for when you're looking for a military profession, and you won't have new expert knowledge or new expert practice unless you have a group of people inside the profession responsible to do that. The law schools do it for the law profession. The teaching hospitals do it for the medical profession. And this institution and those people that I just mentioned do it for the military professions. So you have to have these essential characteristics, and they have to create external trust. And if they do, you have a profession. Now, very quickly, I'm not going to discuss these, but I put this on charts so that in your seminars and in your discussion period, you might take a look at this, because we tried to verbalize each of these in about 4 sentences. Military expertise, its own knowledge, the design, generation, support, and application of land combat power. How well have we done that? Of course, esprit de corps. Let me take this one and amplify. Here's a quotation from the Army's new Chief of Staff. Jim Kitfield already alluded to this. When we first went there, we thought we'd have a conventional fight. This is Baghdad, March 2003. The Army fought a brilliant campaign, a conventional fight. It turned into an insurgency compounded by terrorism. We were surprised. We had no idea. We didn't recognize it. It took too long. Honest statements from an honest professional. Why did this happen? I've just been telling you the professions are founded on expert knowledge. And Jim and I are both telling you that when the Army got to Baghdad in March of 2003, it didn't have the right expert knowledge. And it certainly didn't have that knowledge embedded in its most critical operational unit, the battalion. The Army still fights by battalions, even though we do it in an amazingly decentralized way now. But when we come back to larger scale operations, battalions will be the organic unit of the battle. And we didn't have a battalion that knew how to implement counterinsurgency doctrine because we had no counterinsurgency doctrine. How did the Army get in that fix? It's because the stewards of the profession 8 years earlier failed the profession. There's no other way to describe it. I'm not attempting to be unkind to men who led the Army in that period and did it in the best insights and the best way possible. But in hindsight, we can say the Army was unprepared on March the 3rd, and that's your challenge, folks. You're now going through another build down. We don't have to belabor the past. The lesson is to learn from the past and to apply it in the future. What expert knowledge is it that you're going to need 6 years from now? Just as the Army needed a critical set of expert knowledge and did not have it and paid dearly in blood for the fact that it didn't have it. And then when you think about what that knowledge is, are you going to be able to translate it into practice by developing the organizations, the equipment, and the people to do that? The last two characteristics, honorable service. Do you have a personnel system that allows people to be called to the moral duty of the Army? What is the moral duty of the Army? The moral duty of the Army is simple to define. Defend a defenseless nation. That's it. But that calls for a life of service and sacrifice. Not everybody's called to that. And then this issue that I've been talking about, profession. So 6 essential characteristics, which we will be writing in our doctrines on... Okay, come on, machine. Got it. So here's the realities that let me sum up. Here are the realities. You can't just walk around and declare yourself to be a profession. That doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because you folks are too smart. And your subordinates are too smart. And if the institution starts behaving that way, you're going to walk. So you can't just walk around declaring yourself to be a profession. Stewards of the profession can't do that. Further, profession is not the natural state of your service or my service or the Air Force. The natural state of an armed forces in the United States, by act of Congress, is to be a hierarchical bureaucracy, and that's exactly the way that Congress wants you, and that's exactly the way that Congress will keep you, unless your stewards lead your institution into the behavior of a profession. Think about it. Congress still has annual appropriations. They don't trust you with money more than a year. They limit you by manpower down to the man day for civilians. They don't trust you? Of course not. They're treating you like a bureaucracy. They want you right under their thumb. And if you're not very careful, folks, in a build down, when that pressure is at its height, your institution will react immediately with bureaucratic behavior unless you and the stewards above you do not allow that to happen. So that's the default, is to be a bureaucracy, and yet we want profession. Now let's talk about developing professionals. Now I want to leave the institutional level and talk for a couple of minutes about developing professionals. And one of the big issues is certifications. As the last chart noted, to develop a professional is a mutual proposition. The Army doesn't just train its soldiers. The process is development. Training is only one aspect of it. Development's a function of training and education and experience, where the tacit knowledge is learned. So you took an oath, you were an apprentice, an aspiring professional. There is at some point a first certification. You probably remember when your first certification was, and you were certified to do what your specialty called you to do. And as you advanced, they were recertifying all the time that you were practicing. You finally would retire and become but all the way through this process, this is a mutual proposition. You have to prepare yourself for the certifications. You have to sacrifice for them. You have to be motivated for them. But the institution has to give you the imprimatur of success. How do military professions certify their professionals? Traditionally, they do it in two molds. They promote you, so rank is a certification. Let me stop right there. Any Army officers in the audience? Well, how does that work for the Army in the last 10 years? Majors were promoted at 98%. Lieutenant colonels at 95%. Now, if you were promoted on that list, did you really consider that a certification? I mean, everybody and their brother got promoted, and their sister. So when we went out in the Army with our surveys and started asking questions about certification, guess what we got a resounding chorus of? You have lost control of your certification processes, albeit for good reason. We needed to promote command structure, to expand the Army, to fight the war. But we lost control of our certifications. And so we asked not only about certifications, we asked a bunch of corresponding questions about trust. Do you trust the people above you? Do you trust the people below you? And why do you trust the people above you and below you? And on those questions, when the question was based on competence, quite often we got back the answer, they're not competent enough. They got promoted too fast. They haven't been around long enough to really know their job. You ought to see the answers coming out of the NCO Corps on this. So the Army clearly in the last 10 years has lost control of one of its traditional certification processes. What's another certification process? Another certification process is what you're doing here, repetitive steps in professional military education. Anybody failed anything recently? Well, I'll speak for the Army. Not many people fail in Army professional military education institutions. Is it really a certification? Are you motivated by it? Would you recommend it to somebody else as a real certifying experience that I can take pride in? It is a rite of passage for me as a professional? Well, what we found out in the Army is we got some work to do. Because in the 10 years that was going on, we allowed some of our very best officers to put off school. I mean, we had the embarrassing situation of, well, now I'm on the record, so I got to go ahead. We had an embarrassing situation of someone come up on a flag officer list and never attended the War College. Had been put on the waiting list for the War College 3 times. Well, I don't have time to go to War College. I got one more job in theater I need to do. And the powers to be in theater wanted him in theater. So you get long waiting lists for people to go to school. Suffice it to say, of the 2 traditional ways of certifying professionals, in the last 10 years, the Army has loosened its control of both. And we now know, thanks to the study that we're doing, that one of the major efforts we have to do in going through this build down is to recreate and to put criteria into how we're certifying. And so what we're doing now for this certification, 3 areas: you must certify in expert work, you must be certified by character, and you must be certified by commitment. And I know right now in your minds you're saying, how are you going to certify people by character? And how are you going to certify people's commitment? That's affective. You watch their career. You see what they pick and choose. And you report it in evaluation reports. And you reinstitute mentoring so that you know what people need and what they want and what they're willing to sacrifice to do. It is possible. There is information available in our evaluation systems on all 3 of these things. The point is, we have not been diligent about gathering it and using it. And now we're going to be much more diligent about doing so. Both evaluation forms, incidentally, are in the process of changing. We've also taken these leader attributes specifically unique to the profession, and this is already now embedded in new leadership doctrine for the Army. Officers trust, a major issue a major issue, always an issue. I participated in a study in 2000 of all of the armed forces done by CSIS, one of the largest culture studies done of the 3 armed forces in the United States in the post-war period. And we found then immense trust gaps between the hierarchies of the military profession. So we know historically that there are always issues of trust in high vertical hierarchy organizations. The challenge of leadership is to minimize distrust. You're never going to eliminate distrust. But we know that we have probably, and so we want our leaders focusing on trust. So we're changing some of our developmental models so that people will focus on these 6 essential characteristics of a profession. Now let me talk about 3 minutes about ethics, and then I want your questions. We need some frameworks to better think about the ethic of the profession. We don't have good ones in our service. I won't speak about your service, but I will speak about ours. What does an ethic do? It protects the society from the... Remember, you have a monopoly of coercive power. I don't think we're going to have a coup in the near future. That's not the issue. But can the military profession, through poor use of its civil-military relations, exert improper influence in the political process? Of course it can. You can deny political leaders options simply because you have knowledge that they don't. You have an immense knowledge asymmetry at the height of our civil-military relations. So there's many ways that military leaders need to be able to understand that their monopoly of power, even in the role of simply advising, has the potential to be misused. What does the ethic do? It gives guidance for the status, for the legitimacy of the profession, that trust. What kind of guidance? Individual moral conduct? The great challenge of a military profession in an increasingly pluralistic society is that we now have people coming into the profession who have far different and wide-ranging personal moralities than the institutional ethos. And remember what the challenge always is, to get the individual and the institution ethos to be compatible. That means you are constantly through your career reconciling your personal morality with what the institution says is good, right, and just. And that may not be what you believe to be good, right, and just. And so this is a significant issue. It's a significant issue when you fight on a battlefield for 10 years against an enemy that has no moral principles whatsoever. And we've had some egregious examples of failure in moral conduct in the Army. And every service has. We don't need to belabor them. We need to understand that during the build down, this is the time to regenerate and to revitalize ethos, competence, institutional norms of the profession. That's what the ethic does. Here's a way you can think about the ethic. Here's what your dean was talking about. Professional culture. At the core of culture is ethos. It's a set of shared values and beliefs learned over time that an institution believes are so true and so valuable that it will spend time passing them on to the next generation, not just for information, but for belief and behavior. It's probably the shortest definition of culture that you'll hear, but it's an accurate one. And so what is that culture influenced by? The functional imperatives of the profession. Out here, the nature of war, technology, and even American society. For instance, you're an amazingly privileged culture. Do you understand that? You got somebody in your culture that has dealing with drugs. What do you do with them? That's a privileged society. You don't have to deal with that. Society gives you immense control over the social fabric of your culture so that you can be an effective military. But you're going to have to do that in ways that continue to generate trust with the society. You're going to have to continue to tell them. We got a big debate now about women in combat, and I understand that the decision came out this morning that women will serve other places in combat. This is the influence of the national culture. We just had don't ask, don't tell. All of these things influence your ethos. But over here is a function, and sometimes these compete. Over here is a meritocratic ethic. This is meritocratic because we know that for militaries to be professional, for militaries to be self-confident, you want to know that everyone around you is as good as you are and they earned it. They were promoted on merit. And if they had demerits, they were demoted. They wouldn't be covering your back when you're going in the building. That's the essence of a meritocratic ethic. So women in combat, again, raises the issue of a meritocratic ethic necessary for military effectiveness against a culture that wants women to be able to do more. What's the solution? Very straightforward. Have a meritocratic physical criteria for every MOS. Just one. State what the physical requirements of the MOS or the occupational specialty are, and whoever can meet it serves in it. But don't gender norm the physical requirements. Here, the physical requirements are determined by effectiveness in combat. It's not determined by social mores. So these are the contests that we go through in our society, and these are good contests, and we should have to work our way through it. And that's what the stewards of a profession are for. They're the ones that have to stand up and say, oh, let me tell you about the functional imperative. Notice, these are called imperatives. They're not functional, nice-to-have things. If you don't have imperatives, then you won't have an effective military. You'll wind up like some immediate military bureaucracies elsewhere in the world. And of course, we're immensely influenced by this. So I give you this chart just to let you know that there is a way of thinking about current policy in the context of the culture and the ethos of the profession. Here's another way to think. This has turned out to be very helpful to us. What is the ethic of the Army profession? Part of it is institutional, and as I mentioned to you earlier, part of it is what the soldier inculcates, the soldier or civilian. So there's an institutional level to the ethic. There is a personal level. Second, the ethic comes in two flavors. Part of it is legal. It's codified. We can find it. We can go to statute and read it. But here's the core of your ethic. Remember, the legal foundation and the legal standard is always the minimum. The legal is what the whole society has agreed we can do. That's largely, you can do many things that are legal that are highly immoral. And if you want to find a place to do them, go to war. That's the challenge of leadership in war, always. So here is the harder part of the ethic, the moral foundation. At the institutional level, we can find places that it is written. Some of it is now manifested in culture, especially in subcultures. As your dean discussed this morning, we're all fighting tribalism and subcultures, but here's the hard one. And in the all-volunteer force, this is the important one. These young folks came in because they saw something in you and in your institution that they wanted. And what's going to happen when they get in there and find out that it's not real? It's not there. That's the challenge of the build down. That's the leadership challenge. The moral individual. Our challenge in the Army is, frankly, we've got a number of wonderful icons of ethic. We have creeds, we have mottos, we have lists of values, we have the warrior's ethos. We got all these little things. You've got commissioning oaths. Your service has got them too. Where's the narrative? What puts it together? What explains to a naval officer who you are, why you do what you do, and therefore how you do it, behavior? Where's that narrative? In a concise, simple, understandable, teachable, livable narrative. We don't have one. We're working on one. So, final point. Why did Professor Cook invite me up here to talk to you? Why do any of us care about this subject? It's on this chart. Oops. Oh, no, wait a minute. You really do care. I know this. If we don't have military professions, we will lose two things in America. We will lose expert military knowledge. There is no history in America of a bureaucracy or of business developing expert knowledge. Let me rephrase that. There is no history in America of a bureaucracy or a business developing expert military knowledge. That's done by military institutions. And if it's not done by them, Our history and our republic up to this date says it won't be done. That's your task. Professions create their own expert knowledge. Second, professions use a means of social control that is fundamentally different than every other societal and organizational structure in America. Save the family. They do it by ethics. That's the means of organizational control. The buy-in to an ideation of something that is moral, that is important, and it is bigger than the individual. And based on that, the motivations of the military professional are inherently intrinsic, not extrinsic. The satisfaction of the military professional is a job well done, a soldier well led, a battle valiantly fought. It's not the job, it's not the money, it's not the vacation, it's not the hours, it's not the big office with the big window. Those are essentially characterological differences between military professions and all of these other social organizations. So, my bottom line to you, embrace the challenge. You're going to have a rough 6 to 8 years. And whether you come out the other side of the 6 or 8 years as a military profession is unknown. We do not know how that will work. So what are your questions?